Hello and welcome back. It's Glenfiddich 12. So Glenfiddich really is one of the big boys of the whisky industry. It's one of the most mass-produced, well-known and widely available of all single malt Scotch whiskies. So kind of surprising that it's taken me this long to get round to, I think, reviewing any Glenfiddich. I don't think I've reviewed any yet. Chances are that you guys have probably all tried Glenfiddich, you're probably all very familiar with it, probably had more than one expression. And I bet that for a lot of us, it was one of those early whiskies that possibly didn't set your world on fire and get you really excited, but probably most of us enjoyed it and appreciated it in the early days. Although I bet, like me, probably a lot of you haven't had it for a while. So a little bit of history about Glenfiddich. Glenfiddich, along with Balvenie and Kinninvie in Dufftown, are owned by William Grant's. So that's the same people that make William Grant's blended Scotch. Interesting thing about Glenfiddich, and I'm sure that this is probably a more important part of their brand and success than many people really talk about, is the old round triangular bottle, or tround as they like to call it. Now, the old tround triangular round bottle has been used by the William Grant's company since the 1950s for its Grant's blended Scotch in clear glass, and it was adopted by the Glenfiddich single malt line in the very early 1960s, and it said that a large part of that was that they wanted to take that brand recognition from William Grant's blended Scotch and sort of apply it onto their range of single malts. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you will be thinking what I thought when you heard this, that how come they applied it to the blend and then they applied it to the single malt to kind of tag on the reputation of the blend, which was well thought of back then, as it probably is now, onto the single malt? Shouldn't it be the other way, that the prestige of the single malt was applied to the blend? Well, as bizarre as it sounds to our modern ears, Glenfiddich single malt wasn't actually widely marketed until the 1960s. And it's actually thought that Glenfiddich may have been the very first distillery to mass market their own official bottled single malt. As I mentioned, Glenfiddich is one of the best-selling single malts in the world, with an absolutely staggering output. A lot of distilleries out there that we think of having a reasonably large output might have, say, 4 stills or perhaps 6 stills. You can get a lot of whisky each year off 6 stills. Glenfiddich have 32 stills on site. Although it must be said that the stills at Glenfiddich are reasonably small stills, Glenfiddich is a whisky factory. And this is kind of their flagship product. This is what they're really widely known for across the world, the 12-year-old. So this 12-year-old, we're told that it's matured in a mix of Oloroso sherry and bourbon casks, and those casks are then, they're matured full term and then married in oak tuns. So they actually mature full term and then vat everything together at the end, which me personally I think gives you a much better result than finishing whisky. Just going to get some in the glass. This cork, I like the plastic bit. It's a really nice moulding and a really nice fit in the bottle. Reasonably wide neck to the bottle. Crappy composite cork though. But the reason why I wanted to get some in the glass, I'll just show you the label. You can pause that and have a read if it ever comes into focus. I do like the presentation and the design of not only the Tround bottle, but the label and the stag's head, little red bit at the top, 12 years old. They've had their age statement on their entry-level expression for a long time now. It's great that they haven't dropped that, as Glenlivet disastrously and stupidly tried to do. So yeah, good presentation. But whisky in the glass, we're not told whether this is coloured or not. I think it almost certainly is. The colour of that for 12 years old looks a little bit dark, so probably lightly coloured. I would say definitely chill filtered. Glenfiddich 12 is bottled at a bare legal minimum of 40%, and sadly that goes for most of their range as well. Glenfiddich is kind of a relic of the past in that they even sell their 15 and 18-year-old whiskies at the legal minimum strength. It's also worth mentioning that it's really hard to find independently bottled Glenfiddich. They do seem to hold on to their casks, and it's said that when they rarely do make casks of Glenfiddich available to independent bottlers and blenders, it's often teaspooned, so they're legally not allowed to say on the label that it is a Glenfiddich. So sadly, and it really is sad, that you have very, very few choices with Glenfiddich when it comes to wanting a better presented, higher ABV version. Anyway, Glenfiddich 12 on the nose. It's like meeting an old friend. Very, very easygoing, pleasant, non-challenging, really stereotypical Speyside single malt. So getting a running theme here, because I've just reviewed the Compass Box Orchard House and the Glenfiddich Pomona Calvados-esque cask finished Orchard Experiment, and those are all appley whiskies, and Glenfiddich, even without that Pomona cask, is also a very, very appley whiskey, which is perhaps one of the reasons why I think I mentioned this in my review. I do think that the Glenfiddich Orchard Experiment, Glenfiddich's probably not the best whiskey to apply an apple-based cask treatment to, because it's just a little bit redundant, a little bit superfluous. But anyway, on the nose of this one, getting lots of fresh appley notes, green apples and red apples, lots of sweet, sugary apple notes. Also getting lots of caramel and toffee, which leads me to a tasting note that I always associate specifically with Glenfiddich, and that's toffee apples. Nice maltiness on the nose, lots of sweet honey, but, and it pains me to say this, for the first time, I'm really noticing quite a bit of youth on the nose of this Glenfiddich 12. It's just a slightly immature, cardboardy, damp, just young note to the nose of this. It's not huge, and it doesn't spoil it, but it's there, and I hadn't noticed that before, not to this extent. Let's see how it tastes. So, on the palate, as I always say with these low-strength whiskies, it noses better than it tastes, which is a shame, and it's probably the exact opposite that most people that are buying this want, because if you're buying this regularly and it's your favourite whiskey, not trying to judge, but a lot of people who are at this stage, they're probably more about the flavours that they can taste rather than the aromas that they can smell. And to have this whiskey, which is, because it's bottled at such a low strength, it's more enjoyable on the nose than the palate, probably does a disservice to a lot of the people that are buying it. But it's a decent palate. On the palate I'm getting apple and pear, light caramel, honeyed maltiness, and a little touch of pleasantly dry oak. I think that the palate on this one is simple. I think, and again, because of that low strength, I think that after that lovely, fresh and playful, enjoyable aromas on the nose, the palate really comes off as simple and a bit subdued, especially in comparison to that nose. I think the palate on this one is delicate, it's light, but very pleasant. As for the finish on this one, I'm actually going to go for medium short, although there's lots of fruity apple notes in there, a little bit of caramel, again light as per the palate, with again that slightly disappointing little touch of youth. As for a grade on this one, a little bit disappointing, because in the past, looking at my tasting notes from years ago, I've always kind of thought of the Glenfiddich 12 as a really reliable, dependable, kind of B- whiskey. But because of that slight youth creeping in, especially on the nose, I'm going to drop this one down to a C+, so that's the top end of what I would call good. But to its credit, I think that the light style comes over very well despite that light ABV. I do think that it seems like it's slightly worse, or rather not quite as good as it used to be. But I think that along with the Glenlivet 12, this is a very recommendable and very approachable entry-level Speyside. There's absolutely no shocks or surprises here. It's not going to blow you away, but it's decent and predictable, especially when it's on offer for less than £30. And to be fair, talking about that price point, because you regularly see this for less than £30 here in the UK, you all know where, but it's quite an achievement for a whisky which is 40% and regularly goes on offer for less than £30, and it's widely available everywhere. It's quite an achievement for a whisky like that to get a B- or even a C+. I think that, to be fair, it actually does a lot better than a lot of other similarly priced, similarly spec'd single malt whiskies. I also think that it's a huge achievement that their style changes so little and it's so consistent. I do think that it's got ever so slightly worse over the years, but I've never had a bad bottle of Glenfiddich 12. Thinking about it, it may be one of the benefits that you're such a huge distillery, that you're making these massive batches of Glenfiddich, that it becomes that little bit easier to average everything out so that everything is the same every single time. On the other hand, it's possibly also the biggest drawback that they're making such huge batches that everything comes out exactly the same every single time. There's certainly no batch variation or standout flavours in this Glenfiddich. It's a very homogenised product. Still, I think this one is an absolute and deservedly an icon of affordable and approachable, decent whisky, and it's just hard to hate. So I imagine this is probably... if you're watching these videos, you're probably at the stage where Glenfiddich is not your favourite whisky anymore, but I imagine that for a lot of you it possibly was at some point. So if you have tried Glenfiddich recently, what do you think of it? And do you still buy it? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.